You don't belong here. Show me ID now.
Stand on my own property. I'm a retired police chief. Do you have a warrant?
Don't play smart with me. You think just because you're black and in a robe I won't take action? Hands where I can see it.
Identification, now! Don't make this worse!
At 6:40 a.m. on a quiet Wednesday morning in Crestwood, Georgia, dew still sat on the lawns of Maple Ridge Drive. The street was calm, lined with manicured hedges, two-car garages, and American flags hanging from porches that had never seen trouble. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways and left packages on doorsteps without worry. Predominantly white, upper middle class, and safe in every way the word was supposed to mean. Clarence Dupree, 62 years old, stepped out his front door in slippers and a terry cloth robe, coffee in one hand, heading for the newspaper at the end of the driveway. Through the front window behind him, a row of framed commendation plaques from the Ridgefield Police Department were visible on the wall, each one marking a chapter of a career that had spanned more than 3 decades. Clarence had started as a patrol officer at 25, walking beats in neighborhoods no one else wanted. He worked narcotics, led a tactical unit, made sergeant, then lieutenant, then captain. At 52, the city appointed him chief of police, the first black man to hold the position in Ridgefield's 140-year history. He served for 7 years, oversaw department reforms, reduced use of force complaints by 40%, and retired with full honors. The governor had sent a letter. His officers had lined the street the day he walked out for the last time. Now, 3 years into retirement, Clarence spent his mornings in the garden, walked his dog along the creek behind the house, and read the paper on the porch before his wife woke up. His neighbors respected him. They knew his name. They knew what he had given. He bent down and picked up the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and turned back toward the porch. That was when 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. They moved slowly, almost deliberately, the tinted windows catching the early light. They stopped in front of Clarence's house. 4 men stepped out. All wore tactical vests with the letters ICE printed across the chest. The lead agent was Victor Stelling, 44 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Stelling had built his reputation on aggressive field operations, the kind that generated numbers for quarterly reports and complaints from immigration advocacy organizations in equal measure. His file contained 9 formal complaints over the past 6 years, ranging from unlawful entry to excessive force during detentions. None had resulted in discipline. He had learned, like so many before him, that the system would absorb the complaints and keep him on the street. His partner was Kyle Fenton, 31, 5 years on the job, a younger agent who had attached himself to Stelling early and never let go. Fenton mimicked Stelling's language, copied his approach, laughed at the same jokes, and never once questioned a decision in the field. 2 additional agents stayed near the vehicles, hands on their belts, scanning the quiet street like they had rolled into a threat zone. They were supposed to be looking for an undocumented immigrant connected to a residence 3 blocks east. The address didn't match. The name didn't match. Nothing about Clarence Dupree's home had any connection to their operation. But Stelling had spotted something from behind the windshield as they passed. A black man standing in the driveway of a house that, in his judgment, didn't seem to belong to someone who looked like that. He didn't check the file. He didn't confirm the address. He didn't radio dispatch. He just pulled over, stepped out, and started walking toward Clarence with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of never being held accountable. Fenton followed a step behind, right hand resting on his belt. Clarence looked up from his driveway, newspaper under one arm, coffee still warm in his hand, and saw 4 federal agents approaching his front lawn. His posture straightened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. After 34 years in law enforcement, he knew exactly what he was looking at. And he knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life on the other side of the badge, that what was about to happen had nothing to do with any warrant. Stelling closed the distance fast, stopping 3 feet from Clarence with the kind of proximity that wasn't professional. It was territorial. He looked Clarence up and down, eyes moving over the bathrobe, the slippers, the newspaper. "I need to see some identification." His voice wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the assumption that it would be obeyed without question. Clarence didn't flinch. He had heard that tone thousands of times across 34 years, had trained officers to never use it unless the situation demanded it. This situation didn't. He kept his hands visible, coffee still in one, newspaper tucked under the other arm. "Good morning. What's this about?" Stelling's jaw tightened. "I said I need identification. Now." Fenton moved to Clarence's right side, cutting off the path to the front door. His hand stayed near his belt. Clarence noted the positioning instinctively. A flank. He had taught that formation himself to patrol teams. 2 points of control on a single subject. Standard for a threat. Absurd for a man in slippers holding a newspaper. "I'm a retired law enforcement officer," Clarence said, his voice steady and clear. "Retired chief of police, Ridgefield PD. I've lived at this address for 11 years. Do you have a warrant?" Stelling didn't answer the question. He didn't acknowledge the career. He didn't ask for clarification. He looked at Clarence the way he had looked at dozens of people before him. People whose answers didn't matter because the decision had already been made. "Put your hands where I can see them. Both of them." Clarence lowered the newspaper slowly. "I'm standing on my own property in a bathrobe. I've identified myself verbally. I'm asking again, do you have a warrant for this address?" Stelling stepped closer. Close enough that Clarence could smell the coffee on his breath. "We'll determine whose property this is." Across the street, a curtain shifted. 2 houses down, a garage door that had been halfway open stopped moving. A woman in a second-floor window pressed her face closer to the glass. Maple Ridge Drive was waking up, and what it was waking up to was something it had never seen before. Clarence kept his voice calm. "My ID is inside the house. I'm happy to go get it." He turned slightly toward the front door. Stelling moved into his path, chest forward, blocking the walkway completely. "Nobody is going inside." Clarence stopped. He didn't step back, but he didn't push forward. He understood what was happening. He had seen it from the other side enough times to know. The moment an officer decides the subject isn't getting the benefit of the doubt, every option closes. You go for your ID, you're making a sudden move. You stand still, you're being uncooperative. You ask questions, you're being combative. There is no right answer, because the answer was never the point. "I am not resisting," Clarence said. His voice was louder now, not aggressive, but deliberate, projected. The voice of a man who knew that witnesses mattered. "I am a retired police chief. I am unarmed. I am on my own property." Stelling's mouth curved slightly. "Sure you are." He turned to Fenton. "Cuff him." Fenton moved immediately. His hand locked around Clarence's left wrist and pulled it behind his back. Clarence didn't resist. He kept his body loose, his feet planted. "Do you have a warrant for this address?" he asked again. No one answered. Stelling stepped forward and drove his palm into Clarence's upper back, shoving him against the side of his own truck parked in the driveway. The impact was hard enough to knock the air from his chest. His bathrobe tore at the shoulder seam. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete, brown liquid spreading across the driveway in a slow, dark stain. Fenton wrenched both arms back and snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them 2 clicks tighter than necessary. Clarence's cheek pressed against the cold metal of the truck bed. His breath fogged against the surface. From where his face rested, he could see his front porch. The American flag hung still in the windless morning. The commendation plaques were just visible through the window, and somewhere behind him, the 2 men who had put him in cuffs hadn't once looked at a warrant, checked an address, or confirmed a name, because none of that had ever been the point. The first door to open was Ruth Engelman's. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door to Clarence for 20 years. She had watched him build the garden bed along the fence line. She had brought over pie the week he moved in, and had never stopped. She stepped onto her porch in a housecoat, one hand on the railing, and saw Clarence Dupree face down against the side of his own truck, hands cuffed behind his back, bathrobe torn, surrounded by men in tactical vests. Her voice carried across the yard like a bell. "That's Chief Dupree! What are you doing to him? He lives here!" Stelling didn't turn. Fenton glanced over his shoulder. "Ma'am, go back inside." "I will not go back inside. That man is my neighbor. He's a retired police chief. You have no business putting your hands on him." Across the street, a front door opened. Donald Pratt, 64, a white retired firefighter with 30 years on the job, stepped out with his phone already raised and recording. He didn't say a word at first. He just aimed the camera and started walking closer. "What are your badge numbers?" Donald asked. His voice was flat, direct, the tone of a man used to emergencies. Stelling turned now. "Sir, I need you to step back and go inside. This is a federal operation." Donald didn't move. "I asked for your badge numbers. You're detaining a man on his own property. I have a right to record this." Stelling's jaw clenched. "If you interfere with a federal operation, I will charge you with obstruction." "Try it," Donald said. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk. 2 houses down, a young couple, Liam and Sophia Garrett, appeared in their upstairs window, phone pressed against the glass, recording from an elevated angle that captured the full scene. The driveway, the SUVs, the agents, Clarence's torn robe, the shattered mug. Another neighbor opened a garage door. A woman on the corner stopped mid-jog and pulled out her phone. Fenton looked at the growing audience and leaned toward one of the backup agents near the vehicles. "Keep the civilians back." The agent stepped forward but stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, unsure of how far his authority reached on a residential street where no crime had been committed. Ruth hadn't moved. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching with the kind of fury that comes from witnessing something you know is wrong and refusing to look away. At least 5 phones were recording now. The entire cul-de-sac had become a witness. And not one of those cameras showed a warrant, a file, or a single legitimate reason for what was happening in Clarence Dupree's driveway. Stelling opened the rear door of the lead Suburban and guided Clarence inside with a hand on the back of his head. No explanation was given, no Miranda rights were read, no paperwork was shown. Clarence sat in silence, hands cuffed behind him, the torn bathrobe hanging open, slippers still on his feet. The seat smelled like disinfectant and sweat. The partition between the back and front was solid, no handle on the inside. He had sat on the other side of that partition for decades. He knew exactly what it meant to be behind it. The SUV pulled away from Maple Ridge Drive while Ruth still stood on her porch and Donald still held his phone in the air. Fenton rode in the passenger seat. Stelling drove. Neither spoke to Clarence. Neither acknowledged that the man in the back had told them 4 times who he was, had asked 3 times for a warrant, and had not once raised his voice or moved his hands. The drive took 40 minutes. The regional ICE processing facility was a gray concrete building behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Clarence was walked through a side entrance, past a metal detector, into a fluorescent-lit processing area where he was photographed against a white wall, fingerprinted on a digital scanner, and handed a clear plastic bag for his personal belongings. He had nothing to put in it. He had been taken from his driveway before he could grab his wallet, his phone, or his dignity. He was placed in a holding room with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a camera in the ceiling corner. The door locked behind him. When the intake officer ran his information and Clarence again stated clearly that he was a United States citizen and a retired chief of police, the officer paused. He looked at the screen, then at Clarence, then back at the screen. Something in his expression shifted. He stepped out of the room. Stelling was waiting in the corridor. The intake officer said something Clarence couldn't hear. Stelling's response carried through the door. "Process him like anyone else. We'll sort it out." Clarence sat on the metal bench, back straight, wrists raw from the cuffs that had only just been removed. He asked for a phone call. He was told it would be arranged. 2 hours passed before anyone came back. 2 hours in a locked room in slippers and a torn robe, with no charges, no explanation, and no record of why he was there. When the phone was finally placed in front of him, Clarence dialed the one number he knew would turn a local mistake into a federal reckoning. Clarence dialed his son's number from memory. Nathaniel Dupree, 36, was an Army JAG attorney stationed at Fort Liberty. He had spent the last decade in military law, handling cases that required precision, patience, and an understanding of how systems worked and how they failed. When his phone rang at 9:14 a.m. and he heard his father's voice, steady but stripped of its usual warmth, the patience disappeared. Nathaniel listened for 90 seconds. Then he hung up and went to work. His first call was to the ICE Regional Field Office. He identified himself as Captain Nathaniel Dupree, U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, and demanded his father's immediate release. He was told the matter was under review. "Under review," Nathaniel repeated. "You detained a 62-year-old U.S. citizen with no warrant at an address that isn't connected to any active operation. What exactly is under review?" The line went to hold. Nathaniel didn't wait. His next call went to the Ridgefield Police Department, where his father had served for 34 years. Officers who had worked under Clarence still walked those halls. The name Dupree still carried weight there. Word moved fast. Within the hour, Yvonne Saunders, Clarence's former deputy chief and now acting chief of the department, picked up her phone and called ICE directly. She confirmed Clarence's full name, date of birth, citizenship, address, rank, and career history. She was told they were verifying the information. Saunders' voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You arrested a 34-year law enforcement veteran in his bathrobe in his own driveway with no warrant. What exactly are you verifying?" There was silence on the other end. Saunders continued, "I'm going to give you my direct number, and then I'm going to call the Department of Justice. You have 1 hour to make this right before it stops being a phone call and becomes a federal incident." Donald Pratt uploaded the video at 8:47 a.m. He didn't add a caption. He didn't need to. The footage spoke in a language that needed no explanation. It showed the full arrest from the sidewalk, Stelling's aggressive approach, Clarence's calm compliance, the demand for identification, the refusal to answer questions about a warrant, the shove against the truck, the torn bathrobe, the coffee mug shattering on the concrete. Ruth Engelman's voice cutting across the yard. "That's Chief Dupree! What are you doing to him?" By noon, the video had 200,000 views. By evening, it had crossed 2 million. Local news stations ran it first, then national outlets picked it up. The headline wrote itself, and every network ran some version of the same words. ICE agents arrest retired black police chief in his own driveway. No warrant, no cause. The comments came in waves. Veterans groups issued statements. Police associations called it a disgrace to the badge. Civil rights organizations demanded an investigation. Retired officers from departments across the country shared the video with one line: "That could have been any of us." The Garrett couple's footage from the upstairs window added a second angle, wider, showing the full cul-de-sac, the SUVs, the backup agents standing uselessly by the vehicles, while a 62-year-old man in slippers was cuffed on his own property. That footage was reposted by accounts with millions of followers. The optics were devastating, and they were undeniable. A decorated black law enforcement leader who had spent his life protecting his community, treated like a fugitive in front of his neighbors, on a lawn he had mowed for 11 years, beneath a flag he had earned the right to fly, and every second of it had been captured by the people who knew him best. By midday, the video had reached the desks that mattered. ICE leadership in Washington was briefed. The regional field office director pulled the operational file for Stelling's unit and within minutes confirmed what Clarence had said from the beginning. There was no warrant for his address. There had never been one. The target of the operation was a residence 3 blocks east on a different street with a different house number. Stelling had never verified the address before stepping out of the vehicle. He had never cross-referenced the file. He had never contacted dispatch. He had seen a black man in a nice neighborhood and made a decision that bypassed every protocol his training was supposed to enforce. An internal review of Stelling's record surfaced a memo that should have ended the conversation years ago. He had been flagged twice before, once for conducting an enforcement operation at an incorrect address in Gwinnett County, where agents entered the wrong home and detained a legal resident for 4 hours. Once for excessive force during a routine detention in Cobb County, where a complaint described Stelling shoving a handcuffed man into the side of a vehicle hard enough to crack a rib. Both complaints had been filed. Both had been reviewed. Both had been closed with no discipline, no retraining, no consequence. The system had looked at Victor Stelling twice and decided he was not a problem. Now the system was watching a video with 6 million views that proved otherwise. The regional director ordered Clarence's immediate release. No formal charges had ever been filed. No probable cause had ever existed. Clarence was driven back to Crestwood in the same SUV that had taken him. The ride was silent. No apology was offered. When the vehicle turned onto Maple Ridge Drive nearly 7 hours after he had been taken from it, the street looked nothing like it had that morning. News vans lined the curb. Cameras were already rolling. Clarence stepped out of the SUV in the same torn bathrobe and slippers he had been wearing when they took him. The cameras caught everything. The raw marks on his wrists, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he paused for a moment on his own driveway and looked at the spot where his coffee mug had shattered that morning, the stain still visible on the concrete. Ruth Engelman reached him first. She crossed the lawn without a word and wrapped her arms around him. She held on for a long time. Donald Pratt was next. He extended his hand and Clarence took it. Donald nodded once. The look between them said more than any statement could. A reporter stepped forward. "Chief Dupree, do you have anything to say?" Clarence looked at the camera. His voice was steady but thinner than it had been that morning, worn down by 7 hours of concrete walls and fluorescent lights and silence. "I gave 34 years to law enforcement. I believed in the badge. I dedicated my life to what it was supposed to stand for. Today, that badge was used against me because of the color of my skin, on my own property, in front of my neighbors, without a warrant or a reason." He paused. "That's not law enforcement. That's something else." Inside the house, his wife Evelyn Dupree, 60, a retired school principal, sat at the kitchen table with her hands trembling around a glass of water she hadn't touched. She had watched the arrest from the bedroom window that morning. She had seen the agents grab him, shove him, cuff him against his own truck. She had wanted to run outside, but she was terrified that if she did, if she moved too fast or spoke too loud, they would put their hands on her too. Or worse, they would use her presence as an excuse to escalate. So she stood behind the glass and watched them take her husband. When Clarence sat down beside her, she looked at him with eyes that hadn't stopped crying for hours. "I watched them take you, and I couldn't breathe. I kept thinking, what if Nathaniel hadn't been a lawyer? What if no one had been filming?" Clarence took her hand but didn't answer, because they both knew the answer already. Nathaniel Dupree filed the formal complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division before his father had even made it home. The document was precise, detailed, and built the way only a military attorney with something personal at stake could build it. Unlawful detention, warrantless arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, Fourth Amendment violations. Every claim supported by witness testimony, neighbor video from multiple angles, and the timeline of an operation that had no legal basis from the moment the SUVs turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. The DOJ opened an investigation within 48 hours. The case was assigned to a senior civil rights prosecutor who had handled federal law enforcement misconduct cases for over a decade. Simultaneously, the Congressional Black Caucus issued a public statement demanding full accountability and transparency from ICE leadership. A senior senator on the Judiciary Committee called for formal hearings on ICE field operation protocols, citing the arrest as evidence of systemic failure. The DHS Inspector General opened a parallel investigation into Stelling's unit, its operational history, and the supervisory chain that had allowed 9 prior complaints to disappear into filing cabinets. Internal records were subpoenaed, and then the body camera footage arrived. Stelling and Fenton had not been wearing body cameras during the arrest, a direct violation of agency policy. But the 2 backup agents near the vehicles had theirs activated. The footage was recovered from the agency server and reviewed frame by frame. It confirmed everything the neighbors had recorded, and more. Clarence was compliant from the first moment. He identified himself clearly, multiple times. He never raised his voice. He never moved aggressively. He asked for a warrant 3 times and received no answer. The footage showed Stelling initiating physical contact without provocation, and Fenton applying cuffs to a man who had done nothing but stand in his own driveway. Federal investigators watched the footage in a closed briefing room. No one in that room needed to watch it twice. The investigation moved fast because the evidence didn't require interpretation. It required a shovel. The deeper investigators dug into Stelling's unit, the worse it got. Operational records showed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Over the past 4 years, Stelling's team had conducted 86 field operations in predominantly white neighborhoods across the greater Atlanta metro area. In 61 of those operations, the individuals stopped, detained, or questioned were Black or Latino residents who had no connection to any active immigration case. They were homeowners, renters, commuters, people walking dogs or checking mailboxes, or sitting in parked cars in neighborhoods where someone decided they didn't belong. Complaints from 14 prior incidents were pulled from internal files. Every single one involved a person of color. Every single one had been dismissed internally with language that read like a template. Officer acted within operational discretion. Insufficient evidence to support claim. No further action recommended. Fenton's records added another layer. Investigators found that on 3 prior operations, he had written after-action reports containing fabricated details designed to retroactively justify warrantless stops. In one report, he described a subject as evasive and non-compliant. Witness statements from that same stop described the subject as cooperative and confused. The lies had never been questioned because no one had ever looked. Then came the testimony that broke the case open. A junior agent in Stelling's unit named Omar Bashir requested a meeting with federal investigators. Bashir, 28, had been with ICE for 3 years and assigned to Stelling's team for the last 18 months. He described a culture of racial targeting that operated on instinct rather than evidence. Stelling routinely told his team to trust your gut about who looks like they belong in certain neighborhoods. Bashir said he had filed an internal complaint 6 months before the Dupree arrest, describing the pattern in writing and naming specific incidents. The complaint was received, logged, and never acted on. No one had followed up. No one had interviewed him. No one had reviewed the operations he cited. The system had been told exactly what was happening inside Stelling's unit. It chose not to listen. The outcomes came swiftly because the evidence left no room for delay. Victor Stelling was terminated from Immigration and Customs Enforcement for gross misconduct, violation of Fourth Amendment protections, racial profiling, failure to verify operational targets, and failure to wear a body camera during a field operation. His federal law enforcement certification was revoked. He was referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution on charges of unlawful arrest and deprivation of rights under color of law. The man who had spent 16 years operating on instinct instead of evidence would now face a system that required both. Kyle Fenton was terminated for participation in an unlawful arrest, failure to intervene during the use of excessive force, falsifying details in 3 prior operational reports, and failure to activate his body camera. His certification was suspended pending further review, effectively ending any future in federal law enforcement. The agent who had spent 5 years following without questioning learned that silence carried its own conviction. The regional field office director, who had overseen a system that absorbed 9 complaints against Stelling without consequence, was forced into early retirement. 2 direct supervisors within the unit were demoted and reassigned. The unit itself was disbanded and placed under new leadership with a restructured chain of command. ICE issued a rare public statement acknowledging that the arrest of Clarence Dupree was unlawful and expressing what they called deep regret over the incident and its impact. The statement was carefully worded. It acknowledged the failure, it referenced the reforms being implemented, but it stopped short of a direct apology to Clarence or his family. Reporters noticed, the public noticed, And Clarence, sitting in his living room watching the statement air on the evening news, noticed most of all. "Regret is what you feel when you spill coffee," he said quietly to Evelyn. "Not when you drag a man off his own property in handcuffs." Clarence filed the federal civil rights lawsuit 3 weeks later. The case was brought against ICE, Victor Stelling, Kyle Fenton, and the Department of Homeland Security. It cited unlawful arrest, excessive force, Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Evelyn Dupree was named as a co-plaintiff for the emotional damages she suffered, watching her husband be detained from their bedroom window, unable to intervene, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stand behind glass while the people who were supposed to protect them put her husband in cuffs. The evidence was overwhelming. Neighbor videos from 5 angles, body camera footage from the 2 backup agents, internal operational records showing the wrong address, Stelling's 9 prior complaints, Fenton's falsified reports, Omar Bashir's whistleblower testimony, and the internal memo that proved the agency had been warned about Stelling twice and chose to do nothing. The case never made it to trial. The government settled for a multi-million-dollar amount that legal analysts described as one of the largest individual payouts in a federal civil rights case involving ICE. But the money was only part of it. As part of the settlement, the Department of Homeland Security agreed to mandatory warrant verification protocols, requiring field confirmation of target addresses before any engagement, required body camera activation for all field operations, with zero-tolerance enforcement for non-compliance, independent civilian review of all complaints involving racial profiling or discriminatory conduct, and a complete redesign of implicit bias training developed in partnership with civil rights organizations. Clarence donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for citizens wrongfully detained by federal agents, people who didn't have a son in the JAG Corps, neighbors with cameras, or a career that demanded recognition, people who had no one to call. Now they would. Weeks later, Clarence Dupree sat on his front porch at 6:40 in the morning. Same slippers, same robe, new coffee mug. The newspaper was tucked under his arm. The garden along the fence line was freshly tended, the beds he had planted the spring before now in full bloom. The American flag hung from the same hook it had always hung from, catching the first light the way it did every morning on Maple Ridge Drive. Ruth Engelman waved from her porch next door. Donald Pratt nodded from his driveway. The street was quiet again. But something had changed. Not the street. The street looked the same as it always had. What changed was what people now understood could happen on it. Clarence began speaking publicly in the months that followed. Not on cable news panels or viral clips, but in the rooms where it mattered. Police academies, congressional briefings, community forums in cities where families like his had stories that never made the news. He told his story the same way every time. Not with anger, not with bitterness, with precision. The same precision he had brought to 34 years behind the badge. "I wore a badge for 34 years, he would say. I know what it's supposed to mean. I know the weight of it. And I know exactly what it looks like when someone forgets." Victor Stelling was last seen leaving a federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta 3 months after his termination. No cameras followed him, no reporters called his name. The career he had built on instinct and impunity was gone, replaced by a case number and a court date. His name now appeared in training manuals distributed across DHS field offices nationally, cited as a case study in what unchecked authority and racial bias produce when no one is held accountable, until someone finally is. A training bulletin circulated through every ICE field office in the country that fall. It showed a single still frame pulled from Donald Pratt's video. A black man in a bathrobe, hands cuffed behind his back, pressed against his own truck in his own driveway. An American flag hanging in the background. Beneath the image, 2 lines in bold type. "This is what failure looks like." No names were printed. They didn't need to be, because the careers were already gone. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.